I'm the person saying let go. I said let go of the Conservative Party. Let it fall, let it collapse, be without it. You have no friends at Westminster. If you want a friend at Westminster, you'll have to do something about it. And when I put that to the test, nobody would pay any attention.
Welcome to Confessions. My name's Giles Fraser, and this is the podcast where we talk to interesting and well-known guests and try and drill down into their core beliefs, trying to work out what it is that makes them tick. And with me today in the confessional is Peter Hitchens, social commentator, a journalist for The Mail, used to be journalist for The Express for quite a long time, and all-round scourge of liberalism and all things, what shall I say? What are you a great
Everything
scourge
like you,
of?
really. That's what I'm a scourge of you.
It's a scourge of me. It's the anti-Fraser we have here. Welcome, Peter Hitchens. Peter, how this works, this podcast, is I tend to ask you to say a little bit about your family background and the sort of values that were impregnated in the sort of household in which you grew up, and then try and get a sense of your trajectory, your intellectual trajectory from that place. So could you start to say something about that?
Well, the impregnation of values is most successful when you don't notice it, I suppose. Looking back on my childhood, I don't recollect much impregnation of values at home. I probably saw some quite good examples and picked up from them.
So tell me about your mum and dad.
Well, oddly enough, I don't really remember all that much about them because my childhood was spent, an awful lot of it was spent at boarding schools. And when we were at home, my father was at work and my mother was at work too. She was an early wage slave mother. She went out and ran a shop. So for an awful lot of my childhood, I was either at school or I ran wild.
So the family.
So I'm the result of a very, very neglectful upbringing, and I think a lot of my problems.
So did you go to school at some sort of silly early age, like I did?
I went to my first boarding school at 7.
Same as me.
Before that, I'd gone to a dame school run by an admiral's daughter with a large parrot, which I remember very well, and a rather good pre-prep school, now dead, on the edge of Dartmoor, and then a cathedral choir school where I wasn't in the choir because I sing like a frog at Chichester for a couple of years.
I see.
Then to another prep school back on the edge of Dartmoor for what must have been 5 pretty formative years. And during a lot of that time, as I say, when I came home, was usually quite often, not always, an arrival at a different place, because my father, having been in the Navy and then having left the Navy, having to move quite frequently from post-Navy job to post-Navy job to a different house. And that was life. So there's the solid, secure point in a lot of this was the boarding school, which remained more or less the same.
Was it a lonely childhood?
No, I didn't like the first couple of days of returning to boarding school, the hard beds, the wide open windows, the filthy food. But it was amazing how quickly you got used to it. And in fact, it was in many ways idyllic. And I can't really look back and say that I had a hellish childhood in which I was abused. Almost everybody I know seems to have been either thrashed or sexually abused at
I'm surprised you weren't
school.
thrashed.
None of this happened to me.
I'm surprised you weren't beaten a
very,
bit.
very good at avoiding that kind of thing. One of the things I learned at boarding school was what they used to call column dodging in the army, which is avoiding things I didn't want. I got very good at it. And in a fairly large building with extensive grounds, it's quite easy just to vanish into the into the background like a gorilla and not to be noticed.
Right. And then secondary school.
Well, that was more unsuccessful. I went to a minor public school called the Lees in Cambridge, where we just didn't get on with each other. It looked like a lunatic asylum. I'm very affected by architecture. It was architecturally hideous, late Victorian Edwardian red brick, and it was run on the most crabby lines. And this was the middle 1960s. And there we were in Cambridge, one of the most beautiful and fascinating cities in the world. And believe it or not, there was our map at the top of the steps outside the library, which showed you where you could go in Cambridge, except on Wednesday afternoons and Sundays, you weren't allowed to cross a line drawn on this map, and the line cut off the school from practically everything in Cambridge anybody might want to see. But again, my column-dodging instincts kicked in. I noticed that they hadn't drawn the line all the way to the top.
What was the other side of the line that they were protecting
Cambridge
you
was
from?
the other side of the line.
Oh, girls, was it?
No,
or...
Cambridge. I mean, everything in it. I mean, there were undoubtedly
Sin
girls.
City.
There were undoubtedly girls there. We just couldn't get everything that was worth seeing in Cambridge was on the other side of the line. And I noticed that whoever had drawn the line had failed to draw it to the top of the map, so I would get on my bicycle and ride around the top of it and break this rule.
So, well, you wouldn't break the rule.
So that I hadn't broken it, because legalistically I hadn't crossed the line. It was an extraordinary. There was a rule book, and we had to write lines if we transgressed. Few things are more distressing to a well-regulated mind than to see a boy who ought to know better disporting himself at improper moments, was the school line. And there were various forms of this, and they were given letters of the alphabet. Misbehaviour was bad. Being late was bad. If you were late 3 times, you were gated. If you were just bad 5 times, you were gated. But being late for breakfast was the absolute supreme crime. If you were late for breakfast twice in a term, you were gated. And that was the measure of things. And there was an immensely long rule book of things that you could or couldn't do. And it might have worked up till about, I suppose, 1962 or 63, but by then you could feel the sort of throb in the air of the approaching 60s, and all the desire to get out and not to be told what to do and how to dress and how long your hair should be. And I just couldn't stand it. And after a couple of years, we parted company. I always call it a mutual disagreement. The incident which I think brought it to a head was when I and a group of friends were caught trying to break into a government fallout shelter.
Just for fun.
Well, most of us got away, but one of us was caught, and he blabbed. I don't blame him. And so the police came, and there was a great kerfuffle. And I think that was probably about it.
So were you a bit of a lad at school?
Well, I don't know about that. No, I wouldn't ever say.
That sounds a bit laddish.
Small. I was small and in many ways fairly, I suppose, self-effacing. But I suppose there was just a temptation to break out, and I followed it at that time.
So I'm trying to. Is there a sort of political?
I would have given it. I would have, as ignorant teenagers often do. I certainly gave it a political top dressing. I've been going on CND marches. I went since the Easter '66 one, which I remember quite well, and had developed strong opinions based on absolutely nothing about Vietnam by about then. But these were really a cover for just being generally stroppy.
And presumably having an older brother who had strong views as well.
Oh, completely, yes. The influence was huge at that stage. Only he'd undergone the most extraordinary transformation. He came home from that same school, which he quite enjoyed. He came home after a couple of years, one Christmas, and he wasn't the person he'd been. He'd obviously come under the influence of a very charismatic teacher. He was terrifically interested in things about literature that he hadn't previously much cared about. But he had also been introduced to the joys of politics. In fact, he'd taken part as the Labour candidate in a school election it would have been October '64, the Harold Wilson election. And this transformation made a big impact on me because it looked quite fun.
So that's the sort of the lefty stuff begins at school. I mean, even in a sort of slightly dilettante sort of way.
Yes. It began with Christopher at school picking it up, bringing it home, me seeing that it was a route out of the peaceful suburban boredom which we all used to dread in those days. You know, the click of the front gate, the mown lawn, the peace and quiet, the order, and everything else that we thought was actually terribly repressive in those days. And there was a way out. The thrill of politics, and I picked it up from there.
And what you describe about that suburban sort of click of the gate and so forth, that it seems to me that you reacted against that, and then now you're one of its greatest defenders.
Oh, completely. Yeah, we were little children playing on what we thought we were playing in a sort of Enid Blyton garden where there was nothing frightening at all. And because that's how it looked, but in fact we were playing with grave danger. And an awful lot of people fell victim to it in very many and serious ways. And I have very much reacted against that and see now the sense of a lot of the so-called repression that we submitted ourselves to. It's in Zweig's The World of Yesterday. He has a similar reflection on pre-1914 Vienna, how fantastically stuffy it all felt. But of course, given what happened in Vienna after the First World War and in the subsequent years, a bit of stuffiness actually seemed quite appealing.
So there's the Trotskyite period that comes next.
Well, Trotskyite period, that is a more serious thing, because by the time after I left school and went and finished my A-levels at a College of Further Education in Oxford, which was largely great fun, and there were girls, there was nobody bothered you outside the hours of classes. There were no compulsory sports. I used to pay people to play cricket for me. It cost 2 shillings for a whole summer afternoon, which I always thought was a great bargain. No one ever noticed. As long as somebody turned up.
That's very good.
And there was none of that. Nobody interfering with life outside the classroom. And some very good teachers, actually. And in Oxford, with no line across the map that I couldn't cross. So I had, at that time, Oxford University was in the beginnings of political ferment. They were learning how to hold demonstrations. I remember seeing the first one. They walked almost 2 by 2 like a school crocodile. They didn't know you were supposed to fill the street. And it was actually about racialism. And there was a hairdresser's next to our College of Further Education. It's quite famous at the time. There was somebody accused them of discriminating against black customers. And it became a major cause, and people were arrested outside, and there were pickets and all the rest of it. And we had rather started it at the College of Further Education. The university joined in. So I was on the edge of all that, the 1968 ferment. And about that time, I began to think I needed to get this rather more organized. And I thought that the International Socialists, which I joined in 1968 at some point, I couldn't remember exactly when, as a student at the College of Further Education, which I joined then, was, again, rather appealing.
Like the SWP?
Well, it's not. First of all, there were about 3,000 of us, mostly students or academics, who would never have been crazy enough in 1968 to call ourselves A, a party, and B, a workers' party. We knew we were neither. We called ourselves a tendency or even a grouplet. We didn't like the Soviet Union, and we had good reasons for not liking it, and we didn't defend it. We didn't particularly like the repressive aspect of it, though I think that there was a Bolshevik strain which ran through it. I think we thought we were so right that if it had come to it, we would have killed people for the cause. I think that was the problem that lies in all utopian politics. But we were more thoughtful, more literate than the others, and that's what I joined. And so that's when the Trotskyism comes in. Though it's a shorthand, any Trotskyist would immediately start, so any proper Trotskyist would immediately start coming out with perfectly reasonable sectarian objections to my claim to have been a Trotskyist even.
Okay.
It's far, far worse than Christianity, the theological hair-splitting of
what was it you wanted out of Trotskyism? What was the sort of emotional driver for you in terms of what it is that you wanted to bring about?
There was this feeling of, as in George Orwell once described in the spring when a shiver goes through the landscape, a feeling that there was change coming. We'd heard the Pied Piper music of 1968 in May 1968 in Paris, and we had felt, I think, anybody who was adolescent at that age, a sort of anticipatory thrill. Something was coming. We wanted to be part of it. These days it's called FOMO, isn't it? Fear of missing out. You knew something was happening here. You wanted to be in it. You wanted to be in the centre of it. So that was part of it. The other thing was I'd been brought up. My education took place really in the 1930s, technically in the 1950s, but I'd been brought up for a world that didn't exist. The history I was taught, the literature and poetry I was taught were far more like what would have been taught to a middle-class service background child in 1935 than would most people would have expected to be taught in 1965. And this world no longer existed.
So was it a hostility to a sort of class?
Oh, no. The hostility is the wrong thing. It was a disappointment. I had been brought up to be a Christian patriot in a country which is obviously cast these things aside. I could no longer believe in the things that I'd been brought up to believe in. We'd had the Profima affair. We'd had Suez. Suez had, which I just remember, Suez had knocked the stuffing out of all authority. They lied. They made a complete mess of it. They destroyed us, what remained of our standing as a country. Everyone, from the local policeman to the school teacher to the vicar to whoever it happened to be, they'd all lost a huge amount of authority.
And the world needed to be remade.
And the world. Well, I needed something new to believe in. I'd been very strongly attracted by the beliefs that I'd been brought up in, but they were unsustainable. So I needed something else. Anybody who loses a worldview will feel the loss very keenly.
Are you someone who's predisposed to believe?
Yes, but I think belief is necessary to make sense of life, to decide why to get out of bed and to decide why to work and what to do and how to do everything you do. If you have no belief, it's just one damn thing after another, isn't it?
The God thing is what I really want to talk to you about, because
it
wasn't the
I'm
God.
never inhibited about that.
It wasn't the God thing that knocked the Trotskyism on its head, though, was it?
Oh,
that came later.
No. I lived in this wonderful, dreamy wonderland of the left-wing student world, really, from 1968 to 1973. First of all, when I was living in Oxford and on the edge of the ferment there, and then for 3 very Marxist-Leninist years at the University of York, which was itself, it was as if it had been let down from space. It was an entirely new set of buildings in a park on the edge of York, cut off from the rest. So we went out. In my time as a Trotskyist, I spent a lot of time with dustmen, with coach builders in Scarborough, with dockers, with car workers. It was like national service in a way. We were very serious about trying to appeal to the working class, though we failed completely. But we spent a lot of time talking to them, and they were surprisingly kind to us. And I spent nights in people's homes and got to know them and went drinking with them and ate with them and learnt an awful lot about my fellow countrymen, which most people of my class probably don't know as a result. Good thing. But on the other hand, York itself, as 1960s Oxford had been, was, a wonderland in which real life was at a distance, and then I had to earn a living. And it's such a cliche, really. Having to start earning a living and live in Swindon, of all places, probably the most workful, unromantic town in England, was a bucket of cold, fairly soapy water in the face.
After, as a journalist,
that's where I started, on the Swindon Evening Advertiser. God bless it. Yeah.
Going and reporting about cats up trees.
Flower shows, fires, down to the police every morning, sitting in the magistrates' courts, sitting in council meetings, whatever came. People complaining about rat-infested houses. It was meeting people on their own terms who I had previously thought were despicable, who turned out not to be. So I just found after a couple of years of that it was not, and a fair amount of reading of Arthur Koestler, that it wasn't possible to carry on being a Marxist-Leninist, so I gave it up. And I didn't just drift out, I actually wrote a letter of resignation, which I very much hope MI5 still have. I don't have a copy.
You're very tidy-minded. In terms of the...
It's all part of my upbringing. I come from... My father was an officer in the Royal Navy. You'd expect me to be reasonably tidy.
Yeah, no.
You have to be tidy-minded when you're on a ship, because there's no room to be anything else.
But there's a tidy-minded approach to thinking, isn't there, about a sort of the need for consistency?
Well, I'd like it all to come out, yes. Why shouldn't I? It should all come out, shouldn't it?
I somehow fear people who want too much consistency. It's just sort of like, because I feel it might get imposed on me.
Consistency is important in the daily grind of life, it seems to me, but it doesn't necessarily extend right out into the universe. You can't always. That's part of the function of poetry, isn't it? Poetry is where logic and reason depart from our lives, but at the same time we are moved and educated by it, and we don't understand why. You can't be that tidy. That there's a limit. There's a coast beyond which that sort of tidiness is impossible, which we all reach sooner or later.
So you're an atheist for...
hugely, yes.
I mean, all of
not
this
just an atheist, but a jeerer at religion. Yeah.
Jeerer.
Yeah, very much so.
And did you go to church in prep school and all those sorts of things?
In prep school we would have a morning assembly, which was a couple of hymns, a fair amount of prayers, lessons out of the Bible, which I would often be chosen to read. And there was a whopping great chapel at the Lees in Cambridge.
Did I read somewhere that you once burnt a Bible?
I tried to. It's surprisingly difficult.
When was that, Pete?
That would have been about towards the beginning of my second year at the Lees. I gathered some friends and cronies around and set fire to it on the playing fields.
I'm beginning to form a picture of you that's completely out of whack with the way in which you describe it. I mean, you're sort of like, I don't know if you said you got expelled or not, but you
No, I don't know. I'm always
suspicious
of people who say they got expelled.
I see.
Schools don't like to expel people, and it's rare that they actually did. I didn't get expelled. They would have kept me on if I'd wanted to stay, and if my parents had wanted to keep it up. But I think we all decided it had been a pretty useless period. They sometimes write to me and I say, look, I'm sure I wish this present day school well, and I'm sure that I've got nothing against it and it's got nothing in common with the school that I attended, but I have no wish to return to it. I didn't enjoy a single waking minute of my time there. Thanks all the same.
When did was there a conversion? Was it a slow thing about religion?
Of course, slow. And all serious changes of mind are slow because one of the things about changing your mind about anything significant, which is why most people don't do it, is because you will lose not just friends, you'll probably lose your entire milieu if it's about anything important. People who you previously were on good terms with, who assumed certain things about you, will stop doing so, and it's goodbye. And I don't know how much. I mean, there are a lot of people who I knew at university who would probably cross the street now to avoid me. I don't feel the same way about them, but I understand that they do feel that way about me. And so that's gone.
You give the impression that doesn't bother you.
Well, it bothers me, but
okay.
But I wouldn't. It was a necessary sacrifice.
Yeah.
If I hadn't changed my mind, I think I would have lived a much more crabbed and unsatisfactory life, and also a much less interesting one. And so it's a pity. And, of course, it hurts, and I wouldn't pretend that it doesn't hurt. And I understand why people don't change their mind. It's not because they think, if I change my mind tomorrow, I'll lose all my friends. It's because something in their half-consciousness tells them that if they go down that road, that may be the end of it. So they don't even take the first step. Once you start going there, once you start even entertaining these dissenting thoughts, then you know that sooner or later it's going to take you there. But you're scared to take each step, because each one has to burst through all kinds of things which you've told yourself are important and true, and which you now think are important and untrue.
And this process that we're talking about here, this is taking place when, in the 80s?
Well, I started work in Swindon on the Evening Advertiser in 1973. I resigned from the International Socialists in 1975. I joined the Daily Express in 1977 and went to live in London and felt the lack of political engagement, joined the Hampstead Labour Party, which I adorned. I don't think they would have thought that, for, 4 or 5 years. And I got onto by using Trotsky's tactics, I got onto the General Management Committee of Hampstead Labour Party and was actually one of those who opposed the selection of Ken Livingstone as our candidate. I used to get called to order during my own speeches for irritating the other comrades when they heckled me. They weren't told off for heckling me, I was told off for provoking them. And then that eventually came to an end. I became a political reporter on the Daily Express, and I thought, and I still do think, that you shouldn't carry a party card and be a political reporter. So it was a good pretext to abandon the Labour Party. This is roughly the time when Roy Jenkins and the Gang of Four were quitting. And I was quite sympathetic towards them, though it was always, of the Gang of Four, it was David Owen I thought was the most interesting, which seemed to be the reverse of what most people thought. And I suppose for the time when I was a political reporter and covering elections and working in Parliament, I was probably a sort of Owenite SDPer in my inner life, though I had some sympathy for Mrs. Thatcher. I particularly disliked the way that the fact that she was a woman was used against her by MPs in Parliament. I really didn't like that at all. And I could see, as I would still defend now, an awful lot of courage and merit in the way in which she came up from being a shopkeeper's daughter to being Prime Minister. But the politics worried me.
But you've never been a Thatcherite, really. You've never been a Thatcherite.
I don't think I was ever a Thatcherite. I would have certainly. I thought she was right about the Cold War, and I still do. I mean, I thought the Soviet Union was an evil empire, and I think that, and nothing will shake me from that. But in the domestic terms, I think it was quite hard to defend a lot of it. And now I very much think that the whole free market frenzy which people embraced was just a big mistake.
Yeah, that's the thing that I'm really interested in, because most people associate that, what you call a free market frenzy, with being on the right. And you articulate a completely different way of being on the right, which is really not in thrall to market forces.
Well, it's not. And conservatism isn't about the market. Conservatism isn't liberalism. Liberalism is the one which is all to do with free markets and free trade. Conservatism is about the preservation of what is good. It's about the particular. It's about protecting things. And protecting things, of course, one of the things you have to protect against is the ravages of the free market. One of the things I hated from my earliest youth was the tearing up of the countryside for motorways. I hate cars. I wish they'd never been invented. I think they've destroyed an awful lot of of the civilization we used to have. And I could never square those unshakable feelings about roads. I know I was livid and grieved by the destruction of the railways by Beeching. I couldn't see any sense in it at all. I've been quite pleased to see in the years that have come around since that more and more people have recognised that what I instinctively loathed was actually also a terrible mistake. I couldn't ever square those feelings with the sort of Thatcherite build more motorways and have a great car economy attitude, and that was probably the point at which I really peeled away.
And the Conservative Party is entirely split between those two different sorts of instincts.
Well, it's not
isn't
really
it?
split at all, I don't think. No, it has a kind of a sort of small top dressing of people who are
Genuine conservatives.
well, who will espouse in public conservative opinions, but they have absolutely no impact on the way conservative government works. They're just there as a kind of camouflage. They don't do anything. The Conservative Party is an economically liberal, socially liberal party.
And the and the
Fig leaf, that's the word I was
the political who gets to say the sorts of things that people like you and thousands others want to say politically? I mean, where is that being said?
Well, it's not articulated. I think I used to think that there was a ghost coalition in the country of socially conservative Labour Party supporters and socially conservative Conservative Party supporters, which might conceivably be brought into being as a real political force.
Brexiters, aren't they?
Well, that's the problem. It's all drained away down that particular drain, which seems to me almost to be... the European issue is not a marginal issue, but the way in which it was approached during the referendum was pretty marginal, and it didn't address the things about it that worried me. And I thought for many years before the 2010 election, I had tried to persuade my readers, because people would say to me, well, you talk a good game, but you never do anything. I said, all right, this is what I think you should do. You should not vote Conservative ever again. The Conservative Party needs to be destroyed. And the crucial moment when this could be done is the 2010 election, when if it loses another election again, spectacularly enough, it will collapse. People will stop giving it money. And there will then be space. I said, look, if the Conservative Party were your lawyer, you'd be in prison. If the Conservative Party were your accountant, you'd be bankrupt. If the Conservative Party were your car, it would be a smoking heap beside the road. In any other area of life, you wouldn't keep it. If it were your garden shed, you'd demolish it and put a new one up. So here's an opportunity to do that. And I couldn't get anyone to listen. I remember going to a meeting of the Bruges group. That's the predecessors. They still exist, but they're the sort of predecessors of the Jacob Rees-Mogg tendency, just before the 2010 election. And they invited me to speak, and I said, for goodness sake, the last thing you want to do is have any illusions about David Cameron. He is not your friend, and it would be much better if he lost the election if he won. And the temperature in the room, in some hotel in Manchester, fell so much during that speech that I thought global cooling had begun. And it was a really frosty reception. They hated it. Of course, I was absolutely right, and I've had quite a lot of people who were there have written to me since saying, I'm so sorry I didn't pay any attention. But I thought that was the moment. It's too late. And after that, I gave up any active engagement in politics. It was just making me unhappy. I thought, why bother making yourself unhappy trying to get change that isn't going to come? So now I just laugh.
And yet the sorts of politics with a small p that you describe, the sort of conservative, perhaps Little England in the old-fashioned sense.
Well, no, the old-fashioned sense is to do with the Boer War, but
that's
it's not.
What I mean. What I mean is like not sort of concerned with it. Not sort of concerned with foreign interventions.
There's nothing little about England. England is the source of a huge amount of global possessions in terms of examples, particularly of justice and liberty, which other people have attempted to copy, not always successfully, but even in attempting to copy have improved the world immensely. It's not a little place. It's very important in both. Also, this example in the presumption of innocence and habeas corpus and everything that's gone with it, and Magna Carta is as important as Shakespeare. And so there's nothing little about this.
I guess what I was trying to get
at. It's not those. So let's not use language like that. But that's what's great about it.
Yes.
And those are the things which are most fundamentally important. But no, I will take on cause. If someone wants to build a motorway near me, I'll be among those people who want to stop it happening. I devote a lot of energy to trying to prevent the legalization of marijuana because I think it is an achievable cause to prevent it, and it's very important. And I will continue to campaign till the day I die for the restoration of academic selection in state secondary schools because I think it would be a revolution for the better in our national life. But in terms of wider politics, I don't think that I ever want to get engaged again. I campaigned for the good name of Bishop George Bell as well, because it just seemed to me to be outrageous that he could be condemned on the basis of a sloppy kangaroo court in that fashion when his memory was so important. I'll do that, but in terms of actually trying to engage in national politics or parliamentary politics, the whole thing makes my heart sing.
There is a quite a broad Peter Hitchens-esque constituency in the country in terms of the values that you would share that are not represented at a political level.
But not in practice, there isn't. I mean, people will vaguely agree with me about a number of things, but it's if you reach the kind of level of minor celebrity that I have reached, an awful lot of people will hate you because they misunderstand what you say. And a fairly considerable number of people will like you because they too have misunderstood what you said. The number of people actually paying attention to the detail of what you say, they see you as a point of reference, either a rallying point or somebody they can enjoy hating. And the details cease at that moment to be important. And it's the details in what I say that are the things which people don't like. So when it's like the old joke that Jack Jones used to tell about the man who fell off the side of a dock in Liverpool and was hanging on by his fingertips. And he called out, "Is there anybody there?" And a very distant, saintly voice, "I am here, my son." And the docker said, "What should I do?" And the voice from high above said, "Let go." And the man hanging onto the dockside by his fingertips said, "Is there anybody else up there?" And I'm the person saying, "Let go." I said, "Let go of the Conservative Party. Let it fall, let it collapse, be without it. You have no friends at Westminster. If you want a friend at Westminster, you'll have to do something about it." And when I put that to the test, nobody would pay any attention. People would say, "What should we do?" I said, "This is what you do." "Well, we don't want to do that." "Okay, well, don't."
Well, everybody wants you
Goodbye.
to be. Everybody wants optimists.
There is
not an optimist.
No, absolutely not. Optimism is the key to misery.
Yeah.
There's no better way of making
Schopenhauer, you're a Schopenhauerian. You're definitely. Now, I'm trying to get you to talk about God, so I'm going to keep on.
Very hard.
I keep raising it up, and it sort of like it disappears. Let's
You're
talk
the vicar.
about God.
You should know how to start.
Let's talk about God. When I first asked you, I said, it's not. Is it a conversion or a long process? And you go, yes, it's a long process. But there must be a point where someone who's a Bible-burning atheist will then say to themselves, "Actually, I'd got this wrong."
Well, there's no point. That's the whole difficulty. There is no point. There is a long period of years during which it gradually becomes impossible to sustain the Bible-burning atheism. And at the end of it, then quite reluctantly, you go off, as I did, to Westminster Abbey and get yourself confirmed by Graham Leonard.
Graham Leonard, my word. My word.
Well, I was in the Diocese of London at the time.
Okay. Graham Leonard is a notorious
cleared
conservative.
off to become a Roman Catholic. Yes,
yes.
But And he had a great penchant for watered silk cardinal-like robes, I seem to remember, which wasn't really my idea of what the Church of England was like, but there it was. But that would have been about.
I'm amazed you chose
about
the Church.
84.
I'm amazed you chose the Church of England. It's full of sort of
That's where I started. I was baptized in the Church of England. So, we're short of making a great palaver, why would I have gone anywhere else? Anyway, it's appealing. One of the things about the Church of England, not the hierarchy as present constituted, or practically anything about its outward and visible signs that it has now, but its core, particularly the Book of Common Prayer, is immensely attractive, it seems to me, to anybody who thinks about God, because it's full of poetry. And I remember I had this very early experience of it as a non-singing pupil at a choir school in an English cathedral. And if you experience that at an early age, it doesn't leave you.
So it's the rhythms and the liturgy and those sorts of things that are stabilising. And
evensong every day.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I've done it myself a lot, and I love it. And I do think the rhythm
doesn't leave you.
No. But it's not.
Even while you're out there on the demonstration brawling with the peelers, it doesn't ever entirely leave you.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think the language of the Psalms and of Isaiah is is never very far from the language of the revolutionary either. Not to mention the Magnificat, which is more or less a revolutionary manifesto.
And yet that's the one that you proclaim now, bringing down the mighty from their thrones and lifting up the lowly.
Put down the mighty from their seats, if you wouldn't mind, and exalting the humble and meek. Let's have the proper version, shall we? Filling the hungry with good things and sending the rich empty.
Is that your politics?
Well, not far from it. No,
really?
I think that if you're not concerned about the profound injustice of temporal life, then you have something wrong with you.
I obviously agree, but that's
how
not
you address the injustice, isn't it? I mean, my fundamental conclusion is that there is no justice in the temporal. Justice only exists in the eternal.
So how do you address it in the temporal? I mean,
well, you address it. Religion is as morals are about yourself. Morals are about your own private and personal behaviour. They're not about telling other people what to do. That changes if government starts to intervene in positive and invasive ways, making laws which make it difficult to try to be good. Then I will object to that, and then my political moral engagement is much more in trying to stop government preventing people from being moral than anything else. I wouldn't want to try and make people moral.
But doesn't the sort of...
So I think the huge state-backed assault, for instance, on lifelong marriage over the past 50 years seems to me to have been a grave political mistake.
But doesn't the Magnificat and all that teachings of Jesus that are of a piece with that ask you to do more than just be reactive to what the state does?
Well, of course it does, yes, but most of it is in your personal, private life.
I see.
And in your behaviour towards other people.
That's
the
very Protestant.
Your readiness to forgive or not forgive yourself for things that you've done wrong.
I once heard you say that you didn't know what side you'd be on in the English Civil War.
I still can't work it out.
No, I
feel for Lucius Carey, Lord Falkland, who rode into the heat of the battle at Newbury, had pretty much the same view. He couldn't bear it any longer.
Yeah. You strike me as a very Protestant thinker, though. I mean, in terms of what you just said.
But it doesn't make me anti-Catholic.
No, I understand that, but I'm trying to ask you to reflect upon that.
It's just what I am. It's part of being English, as far as I'm concerned. I couldn't be anything else.
I see.
Because of this immensely old-fashioned upbringing that I had.
But on the one hand, there's this insistence
Some of my best teachers of particular history were Roman Catholics, actually.
On the one hand, there's this insistence on a sort of very Protestant sense of individual responsibility, which you've just said and so forth. But on the other, there is a sense of the importance of community and, family and things like that, those sorts of traditional values, which...
Well, they're virtues rather than values.
They're what?
They're virtues. They're things to be aimed at, to try and pursue in your own life. They're not values.
Because I always think conservatives would want to conserve. It isn't just about the individual.
Of course they do. Yes. That would be the
Thatcherism.
That would be the point, wouldn't it? That's why Thatcherism wasn't conservative.
No,
because it drove bulldozers through all that.
I'm trying to see the sort of like something that doesn't sit right with me about your thought, which is on the one hand it seems to be individualistic. And one sense, it seems to me, about preserving all sorts of patterns of life which are to do with community and nation and tradition and so forth like that. And they don't always...
My simple rationalisation of that, and I can't be shifted from this because I don't think it is possible to argue against it, is that the smallest and most effective, the largest and most effective society in which it is possible to be effectively unselfish is the nation-state. And we're lucky enough on this island to have been able to construct without interruption a nation-state with many, many good characteristics of freedom and unselfishness, which we are currently very busy throwing away. If you read the wonderful Rebecca West's Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, which is a journey through through what was then Yugoslavia, a lot of she's very complimentary about a lot of the beauty and the culture of but she says one of the problems of this area has repeatedly been invaded, and they've never been able to develop the institutions and the habits which an island nation such as ours has been able to do over 1,000 years of uninterrupted liberty, and it's very, very precious to me. And it makes it possible, as I say, to be effectively unselfish. A society in which individual actions fundamentally stay within in the home is one where religious virtue has much less effect than one where you can actually reach out beyond your individual existence. So I think it's reasonable for someone with a Christian position to say, yes, I would defend the existence of this particular nation state quite strongly, and indeed of as much of its lasting elements as possible.
I've heard
from
you,
the countryside to the Book of Common Prayer.
I've heard you say ambivalent things about Islam, insofar as...
Well, I am ambivalent about it.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as...
Aren't you?
I want you to... we're talking about you, so let's talk about you. So, I mean, only insofar as you've said some very positive things about Islam and some of the ways in which you prefer some of the way in which Islam thinks about family and community and so forth. You much prefer that to a sort of... sex and drugs and rock and roll, 60s revolution, drug taking.
I think that's a choice being offered to us, but I think if you travel at all in the Muslim world, you will find that you're often quite moved by just simply what you see, the relations between people and the way in which families work, and indeed the powerful embrace of a belief in the eternal, which is important. I've had a wonderful visit to Iran a few years ago, and I was invited into people's homes, very educated middle-class people of extraordinary piety, and you could not fail to be impressed by it. And I was allowed, I probably shouldn't have been, into one of the great shrines of Shia Islam, and you couldn't be unmoved by the level of devotion. I thought I was seeing here in the great shrine at Mashhad, as near as I would ever get to seeing what the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket must have been like at Canterbury before the Reformation. We've lost something and they still have it. And I think it's just crazy to dismiss the whole thing, say because I disagree profoundly with their attitudes towards women, for instance, or a number of other things that I would disagree with them, because they don't seem to me to have much of a concept of divine grace. There are faults in it. But I can have and have had many productive and enjoyable and good-natured arguments with Muslims about these things, and they don't mind. I've never found one who objected to being challenged. They'd much rather have someone interested in what they think than just be dismissed.
Do you think the male is unfair on Islam generally?
No, I think actually I think we have quite a few British Muslim readers, and I think we're very conscious of the fact that is so, and that they need to be respected as any other reader would be. Doesn't mean you need to kowtow to things you disagree with, but I wouldn't. I mean, you may be able to produce examples. You talk of the Mail. I work for the Mail on Sunday, which is one day.
Yes, different.
It was another. But if you want to come up with some particular thing you want to raise, I mean, no newspaper is perfect by any manner of means. But I take the Thomas Jefferson view. I'd rather have newspapers without a government than government without newspapers, and they will, by their nature, sometimes be not wholly wonderful and lovely, but they're very necessary, and I defend them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always surprised in a way that the Mail doesn't hold up Muslims and Muslim communities as sort of models of some of the values that it aspires to, of family and community.
Well, I don't know. I can't really defend it for what it doesn't do, or indeed attack it for what it doesn't do. I think you would find in editorial decisions taken by major newspapers in Britain today, and not just ours, a recognition that a large part of our society is now composed of people who are Muslim, and they are our fellow citizens, and we should jolly well get used to it and treat them as our brothers and sisters.
I guess I'm inviting you to do something you're reluctant to do, and that's fine. But it's just I have a sense that in that there was an article in the Guardian yesterday saying Islam is threatening our way of life, and by way of life, I think they meant something that you would have disliked entirely. The way of life that apparently Islam is threatening, which is our sort of like our obsession with individual freedoms, the whole sort of consequences of 60s liberation and all of that sort of stuff.
If you want to argue against Islam as a social philosophy, which in many cases I do, then it seems to me that you're going to have to grow up, as a lot of the Western world has tended to think, that because we have better weapons and bigger shopping malls, we are superior to Islam, and we can out-argue them, and we are not. We have nothing in our societies to fear from Islam. But it's not about better weapons. Our answer to Islam is that Christianity provides a social philosophy and a means of strengthening conscience, and without conscience there's no freedom, in my view, that is better than Islam. We have to argue from that. But simply arguing from the point of view of we're richer and we're stronger will never work. That's the reeking tube and iron shard of Kipling's Recessional. It's you put your trust in those and you'll find that sooner or later the far-called navies melt away, and then where are you? If the argument that we have against Islam is a Christian argument, if we're not prepared to make that, then Islam will probably come to dominate us. I've said it many times. It's intransigent, it's uncompromising, it's confident in its beliefs, it's not frightened of Richard Dawkins. It doesn't care if the BBC doesn't like it. It's very simple to grasp, and if eventually the long worship of progress and prosperity comes to an end, and the idea that growth is permanent and will never stop is exploded, and people begin to look to religion again, I think Islam is very well placed in the Western world to take in quite a large number of recruits, unless Christianity reasserts itself. I mean, which it should do, because as I say, I think it's preferable.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's impossible to deny the power of Islam and the beauty of some parts of it as well. It would just be, you'd make yourself look foolish, and you wouldn't be much of an arguer against it if you didn't concede that it had some points in its favour. And then you could never argue properly against an opponent unless you recognise that he has something to say.
You mentioned money just back there as you were talking, and one of the things that I've heard you say very interesting is about. It is a sort of very sort of nuanced approach, I suppose, to wealth, where there's a sort of you have a strong sense of what Ruskin called ilth, that money can be a bad thing for people.
He's back in fashion, isn't he?
He's back in fashion, yes, yeah. But that money can also be bad for people. That too much money can be bad for people.
Well, money by itself. Well, that was James Carnegie's motivation for building all those libraries. He thought it would just be completely wrong for a man to die with so much money, having made no effort to spend it on something better. It's people could you can't eat it. You could choke to death on it, but you can't eat it.
But you have a sense it's corrupting too, don't you?
It's some Bacon, I think, said that wealth is like dung. If it's not spread out, it just stinks. Individual wealth is enough to make a man independent and to have a good life in an honest place. Who could be against it? But vast accumulations of unfair wealth while other people suffer. I mean, who can look on that? It's not just socialists who look at that and think that can't work or last.
But it's not only just bad for society, but it's bad for it's bad for the individuals themselves who are wealthy.
Well, I
think
in many cases it is, though of course not always. I mean, there are people who become rich and then, having become rich, spread their wealth about, and you have to be for good purposes, and that has to be a good thing. I'd rather have a few good rich people than none.
You're a tough person to interview.
No, it's a very nice thing to say.
You sort of you do this thing the way if you try, I suppose I try and generalise too much, but I try to sort of do a generalisation, and you're always good at sort of looking for the sort of, no, it's not a generalisation. It's always about the specific. It's always about the particular. Your thought is...
Well, generalise if you like. I'm sure you can get me to generalise with that.
No. I'm just very interested.
The less I know, the more I'll generalise.
I'm very interested in the particular. I can't help think that I'm sort of still struck by the click of that gate. When you talked about the click of the gate when you're... That's what I'm...
true. I remember it.
Yeah. I think it's really powerful and important.
I didn't like the stiffness, the stuffiness, the feeling of being held in. Of disapproval everywhere. I thought it was an obstacle. Now I realise it was a defence.
Yeah.
And this
and a comfort.
Well, I don't know about a comfort. I think that you have to. We always reluctantly hand over our liberty. You must always be reluctant to hand it over, because you should never give away any more of it than you have to. But when you do hand it over, you should have a good reason for doing so, even if you're reluctant to do it. And I think that actually the old simple Burkean point, the more we restrain ourselves, the less we need to be restrained from outside. The key to freedom is being able to behave ourselves. And in the world of my childhood, people did behave themselves. I can't watch television series about the past now because people swear so much. And I know they didn't. They just didn't. I mean, my father would have sworn like anything in his warships in the middle of whatever, the Russian convoys, but he would never have sworn at home in front of women, and nor would coal miners. They'd swear like anything in the thin seam, but when they took their wives out to the pub I think it was the Saturday night that the wives had taken to the pub, they wouldn't have dreamt of using the F word, and yet the portrayal of the past, people use it all the time, and that's such a simple symbol of how much more restrained we were.
And that sense of people behaving themselves and conducting themselves with greater sense of decorum and so forth, that actually just describes a different world now, doesn't it?
The world just gets more and more different as we move further away from that. I watched over the past few days, but it's a binge watching the wonderful Burns PBS series on the American Civil War. And one of the astonishing things about it, and it happens twice, once on each side, once at Fredericksburg, where the Union soldiers do it, and once at Gettysburg, where Pickett's charge happens, men who we must assume were like us physically, advance directly, unhaltingly, into powerful artillery and rifle fire and certain death for a cause. It's unbelievable to me that anybody would do this, and yet they did it. And they did it unhesitatingly and in large numbers and unquestioningly, which makes me think they were different from us. We are not like that. They look like us a bit.
And when we've been changed, why have we been changed? We've been changed by Thatcherism, by market forces, but it's like part of it, because you're worth it. All that sort of individualism.
We've been changed by Fredericksburg and by Gettysburg and by the Somme and by Verdun. We saw it all over the world, and people thought we're no longer prepared to do that for a belief. And something, as a result, went out of the world. Because sometimes you should do it for a belief, but most people now can't.
Peter Hitchens, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Confessions with me, Giles Fraser. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do rate and review it. And do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be joined by another guest next week for another episode of Soul Bearing, and I do hope you'll tune in then. And do check out the website, unherd.com.